Welcome to the adventure of the Abyssinian Emerald, a Sherlock Holmes adventure from the series Shadows of Empire. The unseen cases of Sherlock Holmes, playing in the year 1897. These accounts, for many years held fast within the classified archives of the Foreign Office, have only recently, I am given to understand, been declassified. They chronicle a period spanning roughly from 1885 until the very eve of the Great War, when the British Empire, though at its zenith, was frequently mired in the shadowy world of imperial politics and colonial intrigue. My friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, and I were often called upon to navigate matters of grave international consequence, cases that stretched across continents and touched upon secrets capable of shaking the foundations of British power. These narratives, which one might term the shadows of empire, the unseen cases of Sherlock Holmes, are drawn from a collection of official reports, intercepted communications, and indeed our own personal letters to various figures in government, offering a glimpse into the complex moral ambiguities of that era. Permit me, then, to commence this series with a most singular and urgent affair. I shall now recount the adventure of the Abyssinian Emerald. Chapter: The November fog, a yellow, swirling miasma, pungent with the scent of coal smoke and damp earth, had settled thick upon London. It muffled the city's clamor, the distant rattle of iron wheels, the faint cries of street vendors, the general hubbub to a mournful hum, as if London itself held its breath. Inside our Baker Street lodgings, the fire crackled merrily, its warmth a welcome shield against the biting chill that seeped in from the gloom without. Holmes had been in one of his introspective moods, lost in the intricacies of a medieval palimpsest, when a sharp, insistent rap at the door, delivered by a liveried messenger boy, shattered the quiet. The lad, breathless from his haste, presented a stiff vellum envelope, sealed with an imposing crest I did not immediately recognize. His voice, when he finally spoke after a moment's scrutiny of the seal, was unusually grave. From Mycroft, Watson, and marked urgent. Such emphasis from my brother typically presages matters of considerable import, often touching upon the stability of the empire itself, Sherlock Holmes noted. He rose at once, his lethargy vanishing like mist in the sun. Within minutes, we were cloaked and hatted, descending the familiar 17 steps to the street below, the sound of our own boots echoing briefly in the narrow stairwell. The hansom cab we procured moved sluggishly through the congested streets, its windows streaked with damp. The clatter of its iron-shod wheels and the rhythmic clopping of the horses' hooves on the wet, glistening cobbles formed a constant backdrop to our journey. This was punctuated by the sharp shouts of unseen drivers, the rumble of distant drays, and the occasional splash as our conveyance navigated the puddled thoroughfares. Pall Mall, when we reached it, was an avenue of imposing, soot-stained facades, and none more so than that of the Diogenes Club, my brother's singular retreat. The silence within its hallowed halls was, as ever, profound, broken only by the distant, muffled tick of unseen clerks. It was a place where the rustle of a newspaper was a startling intrusion, and conversation, save in the stranger's room, was strictly forbidden. We were ushered by a noiseless attendant, his feet seeming to make no purchase on the thick carpets, into this very chamber, a somberly furnished room where Mycroft Holmes awaited us. He stood before the fireplace, the flames casting flickering shadows on his portly, imposing figure. A floorboard creaked faintly under his considerable weight as he turned towards us, his brow furrowed with a care that even his customary stoicism could not entirely conceal. His greeting was curt, his voice a low rumble. "Sherlock, Dr. Watson, your promptness is appreciated. We face a matter of extreme delicacy," Mycroft Holmes said. "Your summons suggested as much, Mycroft," Holmes replied, his keen eyes already assessing his brother. "The nature of this crisis," replied Sherlock Holmes. Mycroft gestured to the chairs, the leather sighing faintly as we seated ourselves. The only sounds were the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall and the subdued hiss of the gas lamps. "A theft, Sherlock, but no common pilfering," said Mycroft Holmes. Mycroft paused, his expression grim, allowing the gravity of his statement to settle in the quiet room before he continued. "What has been taken is the Abyssinian emerald, a relic of immense cultural and religious significance to the Ethiopian crown," Mycroft Holmes replied. "It was acquired by Captain Richard Pike, the explorer, and vanished from his residence less than 12 hours ago," answered Mycroft Holmes. "I confess, the name Pike stirred a vague recollection of newspaper headlines and some controversy regarding his methods of collection in foreign lands." Holmes, however, merely steepled his fingers, his expression intent. "Abyssinia," he mused, his voice sharpening with interest. "An independent kingdom, guarding its sovereignty like a lioness her cubs. The timing of this theft, Mycroft, it reeks of design, does it not?" Sherlock Holmes said. Mycroft nodded, his features grim. "Precisely. We are, as you may be aware, in the midst of highly sensitive negotiations with Emperor Menelik's envoys concerning, let us say, mutual interests along the Nile basin," responded Mycroft Holmes. Mycroft paused, allowing the significance of this revelation to settle in the quiet room. The only sound for a moment was the steady tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hall, each beat seeming to mark a moment closer to potential crisis. The disappearance of this emerald, particularly given the questionable circumstances of its arrival in England, he continued, his voice grave, could be interpreted as a grave insult, a deliberate provocation, answered Mycroft Holmes. "It threatens to derail everything. The diplomatic fallout," he added, his voice dropping to an almost conspiratorial whisper, "could be catastrophic," remarked Mycroft Holmes. Mycroft's words seemed to thicken the very air of the room. I turned to Holmes, expecting to see the familiar spark of excitement in his eyes. Instead, I found a gaze as deep and inscrutable as the Thames on a moonless night. In that moment, I glimpsed the profound understanding passing between the brothers, a silent acknowledgment of the precarious diplomatic tightrope we now walked upon. "So, it is not merely a jewel we seek, but the preservation of peace and the safeguarding of imperial strategy," remarked Sherlock Holmes. He murmured this more to himself than to us, his gaze distant for a moment, as if surveying the vast chessboard of international affairs. Then his focus sharpened, and he turned fully to his brother, the energy returning to his voice. "The details of Captain Pike, his residence, the circumstances of the theft, I shall require everything you know forthwith," explained Sherlock Holmes. "Watson and I will, of course, take the case. Its implications are too significant to ignore." "Excellent, Sherlock. I anticipated no less," said Mycroft Holmes. "Captain Pike resides in Bloomsbury. I have his address and a summary of the initial police report here," said Mycroft Holmes. A flicker of relief crossed Mycroft's face as he produced a slim folder from an inner pocket of his waistcoat, extending it towards Holmes. "The premises are, I believe, still secured," replied Mycroft Holmes. Holmes took the folder, the crisp rustle of paper accompanying the quick flick of his long fingers through its contents. The game, as he was so fond of saying, was afoot, and from the gravity of its beginning, I sensed this would be a pursuit fraught with complexities far beyond those of a common crime. "Then our first port of call must be Captain Pike's establishment," Holmes declared, rising. "Come, Watson, there is no time to be lost when the stability of nations hangs in the balance," replied Sherlock Holmes. A hansom cab pulled up before a respectable terraced house in Bloomsbury. Above, the grey London sky threatened rain, though not a drop fell. As Holmes paid the driver, the main sound was the low rumble of iron-shod wheels on a nearby street. Captain Richard Pike himself, known for his flamboyance, opened the door before Holmes could knock. He was a stout, florid-faced man with a theatrical sweep of greying hair. His restless energy seemed barely contained by the narrow hallway. A faint, metallic tang of stale cigar smoke already clung to the air around him. Mr. Holmes, at last. A devilish business, this. Come in, come in. My sanctum sanctorum has been violated, ransacked by fiends, replied Captain Richard Pike. He led us with agitated strides, the floorboards groaning beneath his considerable weight, into what was clearly his study. The scene was one of utter chaos. Books lay splayed on the floor, their pages crumpled. Drawers had been pulled out, their contents violently strewn about, speaking of a frantic search. A heavy oak desk was overturned. Papers, maps, and curious foreign trinkets were scattered like leaves after a storm. The air was thick with the scent of disturbed dust and old paper. Near the window, an ornate display case stood empty, its glass door hanging askew on one hinge, a silent sign of its recent violation. Indeed, Captain, a most energetic burglar. You have touched nothing, I presume, since discovering this, replied Sherlock Holmes. Touched nothing. Good heavens, man, I've barely dared to breathe in here. The Abyssinian emerald is gone. It's an outrage, Captain Richard Pike replied. My companion nodded slowly, his keen grey eyes already fixed on the floor near the overturned desk. He dropped to one knee, ignoring the dust, and produced his usual lens. The floorboards here were dark and polished. Against them, something minute had caught his attention. I heard the faint click of his lens case snapping open. Curious. Watson, your eyes are younger than mine. Observe this. Does it not possess a faint luminescence, even in this dim light? Sherlock Holmes noted. I peered closely. It was a mere speck. Yet as Holmes angled it, I could see a very faint, almost ghostly glow, a pale greenish hue coming from its surface. It was unlike anything I had seen before. It does indeed, Holmes. Some sort of phosphorescent paint, perhaps, Dr. John Watson inquired. Precisely, Watson, and not commonly found in a gentleman's study, wouldn't you agree? And this, declared Sherlock Holmes. His attention then shifted, and he sniffed the air delicately near a small, overturned humidor. He stooped again, picking up a pinch of ash from the carpet. Is the ash of a Bavarian cigar, specifically a Regalia Meisterstück, quite rare and quite expensive. An unusual choice for your common housebreaker, Captain Pike, Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. Bavarian cigars, luminous paint. What in blazes has that to do with my emerald? Some damned foreign agent, I'll wager, incensed by my rightful acquisition, said Captain Richard Pike. Holmes did not reply directly to Pike's outburst. Instead, he moved with silent purpose towards the violated display case. He leaned close, his hawk-like nose almost touching the velvet lining where the emerald had presumably rested. A different scent mingled with the dust here, subtle yet distinct. It was a faint, sweet, and somewhat spicy aroma, one I vaguely recalled from my days in the East. Captain Pike, have you recently burned incense in this room? Abyssinian incense, to be precise, Sherlock Holmes said. Incense? Good Lord, no. Can't abide the stuff. Stinks like a heathen temple. Why do you ask? Answered Captain Richard Pike. Holmes straightened, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. He made no comment on Pike's denial. Instead, he turned to me, the faintest of smiles on his lips. The sound of a passing dray cart, its heavy wheels grinding on the cobbles outside, briefly filled the room. Luminous paint, Watson, a connoisseur's cigar, and the ghost of an exotic fragrance. Our thief certainly has peculiar tastes, or perhaps wishes us to believe so. This affair grows more complex with each observation. To understand this theft, we must first fully appreciate what was stolen, and indeed, the man it was taken from. Captain Pike's exploits are well documented, though perhaps not always accurately. I believe our next stop must be someone who can shed more light on the social life of our colorful explorer, replied Sherlock Holmes. With those words, our initial examination of the ransacked study was clearly at an end. But the true investigation, I sensed, was only just beginning. The puzzle Holmes had begun to assemble hinted at depths far murkier than a simple burglary. The faint, exotic aroma of Abyssinian incense, which Holmes had detected in Captain Pike's ransacked study, still seemed to cling to my senses as our hansom clattered through the well-appointed streets of Mayfair. Holmes had been unusually taciturn since leaving Bloomsbury, his mind clearly wrestling with the peculiar clues of luminous paint and Bavarian cigar ash. Our destination was the residence of Lady Beatrice Foxglove, a woman whose knowledge of society's undercurrents Holmes valued highly. We were ushered into a drawing room bathed in the soft light of a London afternoon, filtering through tall, lace-curtained windows. The air was warm, carrying the gentle scent of beeswax and dried flowers, and the distant, rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall provided a soothing counterpoint to the city's muted hum. Lady Beatrice, a woman of some 60 years with remarkably alert eyes and an air of quiet authority, greeted us. Her voice, when she spoke, was clear and possessed a certain briskness, accustomed to being heard. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, an unexpected pleasure. To what do I owe this visit? I trust it is not mere social fancy that brings London's foremost consulting detective to my door." Lady Beatrice Foxglove said. "Indeed not, Lady Foxglove. Your insights are what we seek. You are acquainted, I believe, with Captain Richard Pike," observed Sherlock Holmes. A subtle flicker, perhaps of distaste, crossed Lady Foxglove's features before she composed herself. The rustle of her silk gown was the only sound for a moment. "Acquainted. One could say that, Mr. Holmes. Captain Pike makes it his business to be known," said Lady Beatrice Foxglove. She paused, perhaps selecting her words carefully, a delicate teacup poised in her hand. "A most flamboyant gentleman, though his reputation, well, it precedes him like the fanfare of a rather loud and occasionally discordant trumpet." Lady Beatrice Foxglove replied. "His methods of acquiring artifacts, for instance." "What is the common whisper on that score?" Sherlock Holmes said. Lady Foxglove leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a more confidential tone. "Whisper? My dear Mr. Holmes, it is often a roar," responded Lady Beatrice Foxglove. Her gaze sharpened, and she tapped a thoughtful finger against her chin. "Aggressive is the kindest term. Many, particularly those familiar with the lands he frequents, would use harsher words," Lady Beatrice Foxglove replied. A faint sigh escaped her, hinting at unspoken stories. "Plunder," some have suggested, is not entirely inaccurate when describing how certain treasures find their way into his collection. "He has a knack for arriving when local governance is unsettled," said Lady Beatrice Foxglove. Holmes nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the lady. I could see he was absorbing every nuance. "And this Abyssinian emerald, Lady Foxglove, its significance is, I gather, more than purely monetary," observed Sherlock Holmes. "Infinitely more. I have it on good authority from those who understand such matters far better than I," responded Lady Beatrice Foxglove. Lady Foxglove adjusted a lace cuff, her expression serious. "That it is considered a sacred relic, tied to their ancient royal line, a symbol of their very sovereignty and spiritual heritage," remarked Lady Beatrice Foxglove. The ticking of the grandfather clock seemed to grow louder in the momentary silence. Its presence in Pike's hands was already causing considerable disquiet within diplomatic circles, even before this theft, said Lady Beatrice Foxglove. The gravity in her voice was unmistakable. The distant rumble of a carriage passing on the street outside seemed to underscore her words. "So its disappearance could have serious international repercussions?" Dr. John Watson inquired. "Precisely, Dr. Watson. Abyssinia, as you know, remains fiercely independent, a key player in that part of Africa. Our government is currently engaged in most delicate negotiations with them concerning Nile water rights." Lady Beatrice Foxglove answered. Lady Foxglove paused. her expression grave as she continued. An incident like this, perceived as a further insult to their dignity, or worse, a British plot, could unravel everything. The Diogenes Club's concern is, I assure you, entirely justified, answered Lady Beatrice Foxglove. Holmes rose, his tall figure casting a long shadow in the afternoon light. As he moved, the floorboards creaked softly beneath his feet. The energy that had seemed coiled within him now began to unfurl, his eyes gleaming with renewed purpose. Your intelligence, Lady Foxglove, has been invaluable. It confirms my suspicion that this is no common theft, stated Sherlock Holmes. Holmes paced a short step or two, the floorboards creaking faintly beneath his weight. The thief, whoever they may be, likely understands the emerald's true worth, not merely its market price, but its profound cultural and political weight. Sherlock Holmes responded. He stopped, his gaze piercing. This narrows the field considerably, explained Sherlock Holmes. He paused, his keen eyes thoughtful. The Abyssinian legation here in London, I presume they are aware of Captain Pike's acquisition, Sherlock Holmes noted. Painfully aware, Mr. Holmes, said Lady Beatrice Foxglove. Lady Foxglove nodded, a hint of sympathy in her expression. Young Lidge Alemyehu, their chief diplomat, is a most dignified and passionate advocate for his nation's heritage, answered Lady Beatrice Foxglove. She smoothed her silk gown, a thoughtful gesture. He has made his displeasure known, albeit through diplomatic channels, answered Lady Beatrice Foxglove. A new light gleamed in Holmes's eyes. He exchanged a significant glance with me. Then it seems our next conversation must be with Lidge Alemyehu himself. Watson, our path becomes clearer. The political intricacies of this affair are as vital as any physical clue, Sherlock Holmes noted. With our thanks conveyed, we took our leave, the weighty implications of Lady Foxglove's words echoing in my mind. The game, as Holmes would say, was indeed afoot, and its board was far larger and more complex than I had initially conceived. Our meeting with Lady Foxglove had cast a shadow over our investigation. Now, as Holmes and I approached the Abyssinian embassy, anticipation quickened our steps. The building, situated in a respectable, though not overly grand, quarter of London, possessed an air of quiet dignity. As we approached, the distant clip-clop of a hansom cab faded, replaced by an almost reverent hush around the embassy itself. The faint, rhythmic clatter of a typewriter from some distant office was the only sound to break the stillness as we were shown into a reception room. It was furnished with a curious blend of European practicality and exotic tapestries that spoke of a far-off land. The soft turn of a doorknob heralded Lidge Alemyehu's entrance. He was a young man, clad in dark, impeccably tailored European attire that seemed to sit a little uneasily upon his slender frame, as if he longed for robes more suited to his station and heritage. His countenance was handsome, his eyes dark and intelligent, yet they held a profound sadness, a shadow that even his courteous smile could not entirely dispel. A faint, almost imperceptible scent of incense clung to the air around him. Holmes's voice, when he addressed the diplomat, was moderated from its usual sharpness, carrying a tone of formal respect. Lidge Alemyehu, I thank you for agreeing to see us on such short notice. We are investigating the disappearance of the emerald recently in the possession of Captain Richard Pike. Sherlock Holmes responded. The diplomat inclined his head, his own voice low and measured, each word chosen with care. Mr. Holmes, Lidge Alemyehu answered. Alemyehu's voice carried a hint of reverence. Your reputation precedes you. This theft, it deeply troubles my government, and yours too, I imagine, Lidge Alemyehu answered. I observed the subtle tightening of his hands, clasped before him. There was a tension in his stillness that belied his calm exterior. The distant rumble of an omnibus passing on the street outside seemed to momentarily accentuate the quiet gravity within the room. Holmes affirmed, his eyes fixed on Alemyehu. Distressing indeed. This emerald, Lidge Alemyehu, it is more than a mere jewel to your people, is it not? Its value transcends the monetary, observed Sherlock Holmes. A flicker of profound emotion crossed the diplomat's face. His voice, when he spoke again, vibrated with a deeply suppressed fervor, the quiet intensity causing a nearby paperweight to hum almost imperceptibly. Mr. Holmes, you speak of the Medrekite Tzaddik, the pillar of righteousness. It is not merely an emerald. It is a sacred relic, an emblem of our ancient royal line, a touchstone of our faith and our history for centuries uncounted. Its acquisition by Captain Pike was a desecration, remarked Lidge Alemiehu. The word desecration hung in the air, heavy and resonant. In the ensuing silence, the slow tick-tock of a grandfather clock from the hall seemed to grow louder, each beat underscoring the gravity. I could see the pulse throbbing in Alemyehu's temple. This was no mere theft of a valuable. It was, in his eyes, an act of sacrilege. Holmes's tone softened almost imperceptibly, a subtle shift in the room's charged atmosphere. Your devotion is evident and understandable. Yet, you must appreciate the precarious position this theft, following its contentious acquisition, places your country in, especially given the delicate negotiations currently underway, explained Sherlock Holmes. Alemyehu's reply was firm, though edged with a profound sorrow. He drew a quiet breath, the sound barely audible. It is a position forced upon us, Mr. Holmes. A wound reopened, not of our making. We desire only justice and the return of that which is sacred to our soil, answered Lidge Alemyehu. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering, a hawk sighting its quarry. The silence in the room was broken only by the faint rustle of papers from an adjoining office, a mundane sound contrasting sharply with the potent emotions at play. You were aware, were you not, Lidge Alemyehu, that Captain Pike had brought the Medrekite Tzaddik to London before its public exhibition was announced? Such news, of such a significant artifact, would travel swiftly to those who hold it most dear. Sherlock Holmes said. There was a fractional pause, a moment of internal debate that Holmes did not miss. The only sound was the faint crackle of the fire in the grate. Then, Alemyehu's voice became carefully neutral as he stated, we were informed, through certain channels, that a treasure of profound significance to Abyssinia had arrived in this city under regrettable circumstances. Yes, responded Lidge Alemyehu. Holmes nodded slowly, absorbing the admission. The diplomat's words, though guarded, confirmed the depth of feeling and the prior knowledge that placed him, despite his diplomatic immunity, in a complex position. I saw Holmes file away this information, his mind already racing ahead, the cogs turning with an almost audible click to my imagination. Indeed, the currents of this affair run deeper and swifter than a simple theft. The implications are far-reaching, Sherlock Holmes said. Holmes rose, the slight scrape of his chair on the polished floor echoing briefly. I followed suit. He turned to me, his expression thoughtful. Our gratitude for your candor, Lidge Alemyehu. Watson, our next port of call must be the Foreign Office. The ripples of this missing stone are already troubling the waters of Whitehall, stated Sherlock Holmes. As we took our leave, the heavy embassy door closed behind us with a soft, decisive click. The sudden quiet of the street, punctuated by the distant cry of a news vendor and the clatter of hooves on cobblestone, felt almost jarring after the intensity within. I felt the weight of empires pressing in. The quiet dignity of the Abyssinian diplomat, caught between duty and devotion, lingered in my mind, a poignant counterpoint to the brashness of Captain Pike. The game was afoot, and its board, I sensed with a shiver despite the mild air, was rapidly expanding. Following our interview with the Abyssinian diplomat, Lidge Alemyehu, whose strained voice and hesitant words had spoken volumes of his inner conflict, Holmes had grown unusually pensive. He declared our next port of call must be the very heart of imperial governance, the Foreign Office in Whitehall. The gravity of his tone suggested he anticipated matters of considerable delicacy. The ripples from this emerald's disappearance, Watson, extend far beyond Captain Pike's drawing room. They lap at the shores of international diplomacy, and I suspect may threaten to become a tidal wave. Sherlock Holmes noted. The clatter of our hansom, drawing to a halt, echoed before the imposing stone facade of the Foreign Office. Within, the air was cool and hushed, the scent of beeswax and old paper heavy in the corridors. Our boots resounded on the polished marble floors as a liveried attendant, whose quiet efficiency was marked by the faintest rustle of his uniform, led us to an anteroom. After a brief wait, during which the only sound was the distant, rhythmic ticking of a grand clock, a door opened with a soft click, and we were ushered into the presence of Sir Julian Finch, an undersecretary of considerable standing. Sir Julian was a man of middle years, the weight of empire audible in his measured tones, his manner courteous but reserved. He acknowledged us with a brief, formal sound of assent, his voice a carefully modulated baritone that seemed accustomed to confidential discourse. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, your reputation precedes you, of course. I confess, the summons from the Diogenes Club regarding this unfortunate matter of Captain Pike's emerald has caused some disquiet here." Sir Julian Finch replied. "Pray be seated, gentlemen," Sir Julian Finch said. The leather of the upright chairs sighed faintly as we complied. My gaze drifted to a large map of Africa behind his mahogany desk, its depiction of the Nile's course prominent. I heard Holmes give a soft, thoughtful hem as his attention, no doubt, also fixed upon it. Disquiet, Sir Julian. I should imagine alarm might be a more fitting term, particularly given the current sensitivities surrounding Abyssinia and the Nile water rights negotiations, observed Sherlock Holmes. Sir Julian's composure flickered for the briefest of moments. The soft scrape of metal on wood betrayed his tightening grip on a letter opener. From an adjacent office came the faint rustle of papers, a whisper of activity that only heightened the palpable tension in the room. "You are remarkably well informed, Mr. Holmes. Those negotiations are at a most delicate juncture. Any incident that might be construed as an affront to the Abyssinian crown, or indeed that might empower certain factions within their delegation, could have consequences reaching far beyond the value of any jewel," answered Sir Julian Finch. I heard the slight creak of Holmes's chair as he leaned forward. My attention was momentarily drawn to a dispatch box on a side table. I could almost hear the silent weight of the secrets it held, its brass clasps catching the dim light. The cipher upon it was unknown to me, but its presence alone spoke of grave matters of state. Holmes's voice, when he next spoke, cut through the charged atmosphere. "Precisely. This emerald, Sir Julian, is not merely a stolen trinket. It is a symbol, a sacred relic to the Abyssinians. Its theft, particularly from a man like Captain Pike, whose methods of acquisition are, shall we say, robust, could be interpreted as a calculated insult, or worse, a sign of British duplicity. And if Lidge Alemyehu, their diplomat, felt his nation's honor slighted, or its leverage in these talks diminished," Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. The scrape of Sir Julian's chair was followed by the sound of his measured footsteps pacing towards the window. For a moment, only the muted sounds of Whitehall, the clatter of hooves on cobblestones, a distant newsboy's cry filtered into the room. Then his footsteps ceased. He turned, and the profound gravity in his tone when he finally spoke left no doubt as to his concern. "The documents pertaining to the Nile agreements are, of course, highly classified, but your assessment of the potential fallout, Mr. Holmes, is unfortunately astute. The situation is indeed perilous. The loss of this emerald could unravel years of careful diplomacy," Sir Julian Finch said. I heard Holmes emit a soft, satisfied hum. His mind, I knew, was rapidly piecing together the broader geopolitical puzzle. He had confirmed his suspicions. The theft of the Abyssinian emerald was no common crime, but an act with the power to sway empires. The political ramifications are clear enough, Sir Julian. However, to fully understand the thief's motive, and indeed to anticipate where such a potent symbol might be concealed, one requires more than an understanding of statecraft. One needs insight into its cultural and religious heart, Sherlock Holmes said. Meaning, Holmes? I inquired, noting the faraway look in his eyes. You've that expression which often precedes a breakthrough. Dr. John Watson added. Meaning, my dear Watson, he replied, his voice regaining its customary briskness, that our next consultation must be with someone who comprehends the soul of Abyssinia, not merely its borders. We must seek out an expert in its ancient traditions and beliefs, remarked Sherlock Holmes. With those words, the path of our investigation took another turn, leading us away from the corridors of power and towards the quieter, more scholarly realms where the true meaning of the Abyssinian emerald might be unveiled. The gravity of our findings at Whitehall weighed heavily upon me. The Abyssinian emerald was no mere bauble. Its absence threatened to unravel delicate threads of diplomacy, with consequences far graver than the loss of a precious stone. Holmes, however, seemed invigorated by the complexity. As the chill November air swirled around our hansom, carrying the faint scent of coal smoke and damp leaves from the nearby parks, he broke a prolonged silence. Our inquiries at the Foreign Office have illuminated the why, Watson. Now we must delve deeper into the how, and perhaps a more nuanced who. Our next port of call is the British Museum and a Miss Elena Ainsworth, a specialist in Abyssinian antiquities. Sherlock Holmes pointed out. The British Museum loomed before us, its grand, soot-stained columns a testament to collected history. Within, the air was cool and still, carrying the faint, dry scent of aged paper and polished wood, the vast halls echoing with the hushed reverence of visitors and the distant, rhythmic tap of a restorer's hammer. We were shown to a quiet alcove in the Department of Oriental Antiquities, where Miss Ainsworth awaited us. She was a woman of middle years, her expression thoughtful, her attire simple but neat, surrounded by towering shelves of leather-bound tomes and curious artifacts that whispered of forgotten ages. Miss Ainsworth, I presume. My name is Sherlock Holmes, and this is my associate, Dr. Watson. We are investigating the disappearance of Captain Pike's Abyssinian emerald and believe your expertise may prove invaluable, Sherlock Holmes said. His tone was courteous, yet held an undercurrent of urgency. Mr. Holmes. Yes, Captain Pike consulted me some months ago regarding the emerald, a tragic loss, though perhaps inevitable, responded Miss Elena Ainsworth. Her voice was measured, with a precise articulation that spoke of scholarly habit. I noted a faint, almost imperceptible sigh escape her lips as she mentioned Pike. Holmes, too, registered it, his keen eyes fixed upon her. Inevitable, Miss Ainsworth. Pray, elaborate, replied Sherlock Holmes. The stone you call the Abyssinian emerald, Mr. Holmes, is known among the Habeshire as the Eye of the Ancestors, responded Miss Elena Ainsworth. The name itself seemed to hang in the air, heavy with unspoken history. A faint scent of old parchment and beeswax permeated the alcove, mingling with the cool, still air of the museum. It is not merely a jewel, Mr. Holmes, but a sacred relic, believed to hold the very spirit of their ancient rulers. A spiritual significance, then, far outweighing its monetary value, remarked Sherlock Holmes. Immeasurably so. Furthermore, it is intrinsically linked to the fertility of their land and the legitimacy of their royal line. Its removal was considered a profound sacrilege, remarked Miss Elena Ainsworth. She spoke with a quiet passion, her gaze distant as if seeing beyond the confines of the dusty room. Her words painted a picture far removed from the brash tales of Captain Pike. The silence in the alcove seemed to deepen, broken only by the faint rustle of pages as a scholar passed by in the main gallery, the sound echoing softly in the high-ceilinged space. And such a relic, if taken by one who understood its significance, an Abyssinian, perhaps, how would they treat it? Where might they conceal it? Declared Sherlock Holmes. It would not be treated as common plunder, Mr. Holmes. No, it would be safeguarded, perhaps hidden in a place of symbolic importance according to ancient custom. You see, its value lies not in its carats, but in its sanctity. One who truly understood this would seek its return to its rightful home, or at the very least, ensure its preservation in a manner befitting its holy nature. They would never consider its sale on the open market, responded Miss Elena Ainsworth. Holmes leaned forward, his expression one of intense concentration. The faint light from a nearby window caught the sharp planes of his face, casting dramatic shadows that emphasized his hawk-like features. This is most illuminating, Miss Ainsworth. You suggest that the motive for this theft might be less about avarice and more about restitution, or perhaps a desperate act of cultural preservation, remarked Sherlock Holmes. Precisely, Mr. Holmes, remarked Miss Elena Ainsworth. She paused, a flicker of deep respect in her eyes, her quiet words carrying the weight of conviction. The air in the alcove felt charged with the gravity of her pronouncements. The Abyssinians are a proud people, with a history stretching back millennia. To them, the eye of the ancestors is a part of their very soul, remarked Miss Elena Ainsworth. A hint of sorrow tinged her precise tones. We thank Miss Ainsworth for her invaluable insights. As we emerged from the museum's quiet depths, the sudden cacophony of London's streets, the rattle of omnibus wheels on cobblestones, the sharp cries of newsboys, the general hubbub of the city, seemed almost an assault after the scholarly peace. Holmes walked for some time in thoughtful silence, his brow furrowed. Her perspective, Watson, alters our entire line of inquiry. If the emerald is not merely stolen goods, but a sacred object reclaimed, then our thief's profile changes dramatically. Sherlock Holmes pointed out. He gestured with a sweep of his hand towards the bustling thoroughfare, narrowly avoiding a passing news vendor whose cries of latest edition, shocking theft, momentarily punctuated Holmes's words, the irony not lost on me. It points away from the common criminal and towards someone with deep cultural ties, or at least profound knowledge. Sherlock Holmes responded. He paused, tapping his long fingers together as a hansom clattered past, its iron-shod wheels splashing noisily through a puddle left by the morning's persistent drizzle. Indeed, it forces us to reconsider the actions and statements of everyone involved, most particularly Captain Pike himself. Sherlock Holmes said. The name Pike now hung in the damp London air with a new, more complex resonance. A brewer's dray rumbled heavily over the cobblestones nearby, its passage shaking the very ground beneath our feet, a physical tremor underscoring the shift in our investigation. The acquisition of such an item, as Miss Ainsworth so delicately termed it, warrants closer scrutiny than ever. We must examine every facet of Pike's connection to this emerald, Watson, beginning with the man himself and the very ground he treads upon. Sherlock Holmes pointed out. His final words, delivered with a new decisiveness, hung in the damp air, cutting through the street noise. I understood then that our investigation was about to turn inwards, towards the flamboyant explorer who had, until now, played the part of the victim. The scholar's insight had indeed provided a new, and potentially unsettling, path for Holmes to follow. The insights gleaned from Miss Ainsworth had evidently set a new train of thought in motion for my companion. The following morning, I found Holmes not amidst his usual clouds of shag tobacco, but rather hunched over the deal table, a pair of rather muddy boots, which I recognized as belonging to Captain Pike, placed carefully upon a sheet of newspaper. The familiar scent of strong coffee mingled with an acrid, chemical odor. The usual quiet of our Baker Street rooms was broken only by the occasional scrape of a spatula against glass. Observe these, Watson, he said, without looking up, his voice keen with suppressed excitement. Our gallant captain's boots, I fancy, have a tale to tell us far truer than any that might pass his lips, deduced Sherlock Holmes. I drew nearer, noting the dried clumps of earth clinging stubbornly to the welts and heels. Holmes had already prepared several microscope slides, and with a delicate touch, he was transferring minute particles from the boots. A shaft of watery sunlight, piercing the London grime, illuminated the dust motes dancing around his focused intensity. Mud from a London street, I presume, I ventured, my tone reflecting my lack of immediate comprehension. Dr. John Watson commented. Holmes chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. He adjusted the lens of his powerful microscope, his eye pressed to the eyepiece. London mud is a fascinating composite, Watson, a veritable library of the city's daily grind. But this is something altogether more exotic. He straightened, a peculiar gleam in his grey eyes. This, my dear fellow, is no common clay, remarked Sherlock Holmes. He gestured for me to take his place. I peered through the microscope, seeing a collection of dark, vitreous particles, quite unlike anything I had previously encountered. Some were almost crystalline in structure, with sharp, fractured edges. What you are observing, he explained, his voice now imbued with a quiet triumph, is volcanic ash, Watson, but of a most unusual kind. See those tiny, gleaming fragments under the lens? They are mineral crystals of a specific type. Their unique combination, their very signature, tells us this soil comes not from the streets of London, nor indeed from anywhere in Europe. It is characteristic of the volcanic earth found only in one remote and formidable part of the world, the Danakil Depression in Abyssinia. A desolate, fiery land, Watson, a place of stark and ancient beauty. Yet, as Miss Ainsworth so clearly informed us, the very region from which the Abyssinian emerald is said to have originated. Sherlock Holmes noted. The implications of his words struck me with considerable force. The distant rumble of a dray horse on Baker Street seemed to fade as I processed this extraordinary revelation. Good heavens, Holmes, I exclaimed, my voice a little louder than intended. But how could Pike have such soil upon his boots here in London? Unless, Dr. John Watson commented. Precisely, Watson, Holmes interjected, his tone sharp and incisive. Unless Captain Pike has, very recently, had direct and personal contact with a location intimately connected to the emerald's origin, or perhaps a clandestine point of its illicit transit. This is not the dust of a London curio shop where the emerald might have been displayed. This soil speaks of a more fundamental, a more active involvement, explained Sherlock Holmes. He began to pace the small confines of our sitting room, the floorboards creaking faintly under his tread. The evidence was damning, suggesting a far deeper complexity to Pike's role than that of a mere victim. The captain's narrative of a simple theft from his London residence grows increasingly thin, he mused, tapping his long fingers together. This discovery does not absolve Lidge Alemeyehu, nor does it diminish the geopolitical stakes, but it firmly places Captain Pike himself at the center of the immediate enigma. A new energy seemed to possess him, the thrill of the chase animating his every feature. Our flamboyant explorer, it appears, warrants closer scrutiny than ever. His movements, Watson, must now become our primary focus. We must see who he meets, where he goes. The answers, I suspect, lie not in what he says, but in what he does, explained Sherlock Holmes. With these words, the quiet study of microscopic particles gave way to the anticipation of active surveillance. The game, as Holmes was so fond of saying, was once more afoot, and the streets of London promised fresh revelations concerning the fate of the Abyssinian emerald and the intrigues surrounding it. The volcanic soil on Pike's boots tightened the net of suspicion. His involvement was clear, its depth the question. Holmes, ever ahead, decreed we watch Pike closely. So, on a dreary, foggy evening, we huddled in a quiet London park. Gas lamps cast shifting light on damp gravel paths. The rumble of distant city traffic and a mournful hoot from a Thames barge underscored the gloom. Shadowing Pike from his lodgings tested my patience, while Holmes visibly thrived on the anticipation. He selected a vantage point behind misty rhododendrons, overlooking a secluded bench near a gloomy pond. A cold wind sighed through bare branches, carrying the heavy scent of wet earth and decaying leaves. Holmes's voice was a low murmur, barely disturbing the quiet as he spoke. "Patience, Watson. Our quarry is a creature of habit, but also one of considerable vanity. He will not keep his confederate waiting long if he believes himself the orchestrator," Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. Soon, as Holmes predicted, Captain Pike appeared, his usual flamboyant stride conspicuously muted by his secret errand. He paced, glancing nervously into the gloom, greatcoat collar pulled high against the cold. His boots crunched loudly on the otherwise still path, the sound sharp in the quiet park. Then another figure emerged from the shadows, as if materializing from the fog itself. Slighter than Pike, he moved with a quiet, disciplined precision. In the dim, shifting gaslight, his attire seemed foreign, and as he neared, his indistinct features hinted at a continental origin. He glided more than walked, his steps nearly silent on the wet ground, a stark contrast to Pike's earlier noisy approach. Pike's voice, when he spoke, lacked its usual bombast, carrying instead a strained, almost wheedling tone. "You are late, and this place, it is hardly suitable. Hardly. One might be seen lurking about like this, for heaven's sake," responded Captain Richard Pike. The other man replied in fluent English, his cadence distinct and clipped, each word delivered with precision. "Punctuality, Captain, depends on the objective's importance. This location's merit lies in its discretion," unknown conspirator replied. They spoke quietly, their voices low, yet the biting wind carried snippets of their conversation to our hiding place. Pike was clearly agitated, gesturing broadly, his movements jerky and anxious. The other man, in contrast, remained preternaturally still, a figure of quiet, unnerving command. Once, as this stranger gestured decisively, a flicker of gaslight caught a heavy, unfamiliar gold signet ring adorning his little finger. "The risks, they are escalating," Pike hissed, his voice tight and cracking with ill-suppressed anxiety. "This was meant to be a simple matter, a simple acquisition, curse it all. Not this madness," said Captain Richard Pike. The stranger's voice, in stark contrast to Pike's, remained level, almost chillingly calm. "Complications, Captain, are inevitable when dealing with items of profound national sentiment. Your role was merely to secure the object. Its subsequent application is a matter for those with a wider, more strategic perspective on the Nile's currents, shall we say," replied unknown conspirator. The exchange was brief. Pike, with trembling hands, passed a small, seemingly heavy package to the stranger, who secreted it within his coat with practiced speed. With a curt, almost dismissive nod, the conspirator turned and vanished into the deepest shadows, as silently as he had appeared. Pike lingered for a moment, a figure visibly deflated and burdened. Then he too hurried off, his retreating footsteps echoing briefly before fading into the damp night air. I emerged from our cover, my breath misting in the cold air. "Good heavens, Holmes, what was all that about? The Nile? And who, pray tell, was that man?" Dr. John Watson replied. Holmes rose, deftly brushing a stray, damp leaf from his sleeve. His eyes, even in the gloom, glinted with that familiar intellectual fire. "That, my dear Watson, was a glimpse into the deeper, more treacherous waters of this affair. Our Captain Pike, for all his bluster, is merely a pawn, his considerable greed and vanity expertly manipulated. Did you observe the man's speech, his bearing? No common thief, that one. His precise words, devoid of flourish, and his pointed mention of the Nile's currents clearly allude to the delicate water rights negotiations. The signet ring's design was unfamiliar, certainly not English, nor common European. He represents a disciplined, likely state-backed interest. They seek to use the emerald not merely for its value, but to sow discord and exert influence upon those very negotiations, declared Sherlock Holmes. Holmes paused, his gaze distant, as if piecing together the final elements of a vast and intricate puzzle. A cold spatter of rain suddenly blew against our faces, a sharp reminder of the late hour and the chill of the park. Pike sought treasure, it is true, but this unknown party understands the emerald is far more than mere stone and gold. It is a potent symbol, deeply entwined with Abyssinian identity and heritage. Its theft, its very manipulation, is calculated to inflame passions far beyond mere larceny. We must delve into the very soul of its significance, Watson, for it is in understanding its true meaning to the Abyssinian people that we may yet discover where the relic, or indeed, those who truly grasp its power, can be found. The previous evening's deductions, linking Captain Pike's predicament to grander international machinations, had left Holmes in a state of intense, yet silent, cogitation. It was not until the following morning, as a pale sun struggled to pierce the London haze, that he announced our next destination. "Our inquiries, Watson," he declared, his voice brisk as he reached for his hat, "now take us into rather less familiar territory. The key to this affair, I fancy, lies not in the drawing-rooms of Mayfair, nor the dens of Limehouse, but in a place of quiet devotion." Our hansom cab rattled through a labyrinth of streets I seldom frequented, the clatter of hooves and wheels a familiar London sound against the backdrop of the city's hum. Eventually, it deposited us before a modest edifice tucked away in a quiet corner of Bloomsbury. It was an unassuming building, yet possessed a certain exotic air. I noted its arched windows and the unfamiliar, almost calligraphic script above the doorway, so different from the plain lettering of its neighbors. As we approached, the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer from a nearby mews seemed to fade, replaced by a profound stillness that settled around us, heightening the sense of entering a different world. "The Ethiopian Orthodox Tuahedo Church of St. Michael," Holmes observed, his gaze sweeping the facade. "An island of ancient faith in the heart of modern London. Captain Pike, for all his bluster, has some understanding of Abyssinian culture, or at least, he consulted those who do. It is logical to assume that if the emerald were to be secreted away with a view to its spiritual significance, this would be its sanctuary," Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. A heavy oak door yielded with a distinct creak under Holmes's firm push. We stepped from the muted sounds of the London street into an interior that was both startling and serene. Instantly, the air enveloped us, thick with the sweet, pungent aroma of incense, a scent so evocative it seemed to transport one far from the grimy thoroughfares we had just left. It was a fragrance of devotion, ancient and profound, filling my senses. Light filtered dimly through stained glass windows, casting a kaleidoscope of colors across richly adorned walls. Tapestries and icons seemed to come alive in the shifting illumination. These images, depicting saints and biblical scenes in an unfamiliar, ancient style, added to the church's mystique. A low, almost inaudible hum, perhaps the echo of distant prayers or chanting, seemed to permeate the very stones, vibrating faintly underfoot. From the deeper shadows of a side chapel, a figure emerged, the soft rustle of his vestments the first sound to betray his presence. He was robed in dark, flowing fabric, his face, framed by a neatly trimmed grey beard, turning towards us. He regarded us with calm, inquisitive eyes, his bearing one of quiet dignity even before he spoke. His voice when he spoke was soft, yet resonant, with a cadence that was subtly unfamiliar. "Peace be with you. How may I be of service to you, gentlemen?" said Ethiopian Orthodox priest. "And with you, father," Holmes replied, his tone respectful. "We are here on a matter of some delicacy concerning an artifact of great importance to your homeland, an emerald of considerable spiritual value, I believe," observed Sherlock Holmes. I observed a flicker in the priest's otherwise calm eyes, a sharpening that was almost imperceptible, a subtle tension entering his stillness. Then, with a slight inclination of his head and a gentle wave of his hand, he indicated a simple wooden bench, inviting us to sit. "Many treasures of Ethiopia have found their way to foreign lands, sir," he stated, his voice tinged with a profound sorrow. "Some by trade, others otherwise. An emerald, you say? Such a stone, if truly sacred, would be more than mere jewel. It would be a vessel of faith, a fragment of our history," remarked Ethiopian Orthodox priest. "Precisely. And it is our understanding that such an item, if brought here for safekeeping, would be treated with the utmost reverence. Perhaps there is a particular place within this sacred space where such a relic might be placed, a location of special sanctity," remarked Sherlock Holmes. The priest was silent for a thoughtful moment, his gaze moving slowly around the church, as if weighing Holmes's words against the sanctity of his surroundings. The faint, ever-present hum of the church seemed to underscore his contemplation. Then he turned and gestured towards the ornate altar at the far end of the nave. My eyes followed his indication. Upon the altar rested a small, intricately carved wooden tabernacle, its dark wood gleaming faintly in the dim light, adorned with gilded crosses that seemed to capture and reflect what little illumination reached them. Our tabard, the replica of the Ark of the Covenant, rests there during services. It is the holiest object in our church. Behind it, within the altar itself, is a small repository, consecrated for items of profound spiritual meaning, awaiting return to their rightful place or use in God's service," said Ethiopian Orthodox priest. A subtle shift in Holmes's posture, a keen alertness in his stance, told me his interest was powerfully piqued. He rose and, with a slight, respectful bow to the priest, approached the altar. He did not touch anything, but I saw him peer intently at the space indicated behind where the tabard usually rested. I could hear the faint rustle of his coat as he leaned closer, the ever-present scent of incense seeming to cling to his very clothes, as if the church itself were examining him. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, his voice low but clear. "Do you notice anything peculiar about the woodwork?" remarked Sherlock Holmes. I leaned in, squinting. "Perhaps some faint scratches," I ventured. Dr. John Watson said. "Precisely," Holmes confirmed. "Newer than the rest. And this tiny speck green silk, I'd wager. Remember, the emerald was said to be wrapped in such material. The dust, too, tells a tale disturbed recently, but not by routine cleaning. No, this speaks of a careful, deliberate placement," observed Sherlock Holmes. My friend straightened, and though his features remained composed, I could detect a quiet satisfaction in his very bearing, a subtle confidence in his movements. The priest watched him, his own expression unreadable, yet conveying a deep solemnity that filled the silence that briefly settled between them. "I believe, Father," Holmes said, turning back to the priest, his voice now carrying a note of conviction, "that the Abyssinian emerald rests within that very repository. The question now is how we might arrange its peaceful and proper restoration to its people." Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. The air in the church seemed to hum with unspoken possibilities. The emerald was close, its hiding place all but confirmed. Yet I sensed that its recovery would involve more than simply opening a compartment. Diplomacy, and perhaps further intrigue, lay ahead. The air within the Ethiopian Orthodox Church was thick with ancient incense and a profound, sound-absorbing stillness. Holmes, moving with feline grace through the dimly lit nave, paused before a heavily carved wooden screen. His bright, alert eyes scanned its intricate panels. He had spoken little since our arrival, his mind clearly working upon the final threads of his deduction. Only the faint, rhythmic drone of a distant prayer broke the silence, a low hum vibrating in the flagstones. "Here, Watson," deduced Sherlock Holmes. He murmured, his voice low but resonant in the quiet space. He tapped a particular panel, one depicting a saint with outstretched hands. The wear upon this specific section, almost imperceptible, yet distinct from its fellows, and observe the faint discoloration at the lower edge, consistent with repeated, careful handling. Sherlock Holmes said. He pressed gently, and with a barely audible click, a small section of the panel slid inwards, revealing a dark cavity. Within, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay the Abyssinian emerald, its green fire undimmed even in the gloom. It was a moment of triumph, yet Holmes's expression remained grave. Our swift, handsome journey to the Abyssinian embassy, hooves clattering on cobbled streets, starkly contrasted the church's solemnity. Lidge Alem Yehu met us at the entrance, his dark eyes reflecting hope and profound anxiety. Formally attired, his dignified bearing was clear, yet a slight tremor in his hand as he gestured us within betrayed the immense pressure. "The Abunas, the head priests, are prepared to meet with us, Mr. Holmes," replied Lidge Alemyehu. Alemyehu stated, his voice controlled but with an undercurrent of fervor. "They comprehend the profound weight of this matter, Mr. Holmes, the sanctity of that which was taken from its rightful place." Holmes inclined his head, his keen eyes studying Alemyehu's face. "Their cooperation is paramount, Lidge Alemyehu. We seek not merely the emerald's recovery, but its rightful and peaceful restoration. The path ahead requires delicacy." Sherlock Holmes responded. Following Holmes's carefully chosen words, we were ushered into a modest, dignified chamber within the embassy. Two elderly church officials, faces etched with wisdom and concern, awaited us. Their dark robes absorbed light from tall windows overlooking a quiet London square, its bustle muted by thick glass. The air held the scent of strong, subtly spiced coffee. Lidge Alemyehu spoke first. His Amharic, eloquent even to my uninitiated ear, conveyed deep passion and reverence for the relic. He described its significance to his people, a symbol of their history and faith. One Abuna, with a narrow, ascetic face and eyes that seemed to pierce subterfuge, replied in slow, measured English, his soft voice carrying undeniable authority. "The Sheba stone is not a mere jewel. It is a sacred trust. Its return to the bosom of Ethiopia is a matter of spiritual necessity," church official answered. "Indeed," declared Sherlock Holmes. Holmes interjected smoothly, his tone one of utmost respect. "And it is precisely that return we are here to facilitate. I propose a formal accord. The emerald is to be acknowledged as the property of the Ethiopian Empire, to be returned under diplomatic arrangement. For now, it shall remain within the consecrated care of your church here in London, until such time as the formal handover can be arranged with all due ceremony and security in Addis Ababa." Sherlock Holmes pointed out. There was a lengthy silence, broken only by the distant rumble of a passing omnibus. The priests conferred in low tones, their dark heads close together. Finally, the elder Abuna nodded, his relief palpable, yet his gaze held a lingering shadow of concern. This is acceptable. A written agreement then, witnessed and sealed, stating the intent and the interim custodianship," church official answered. Later, as we departed the embassy, a chill November wind whipped around us. Street lamps cast yellow pools on damp pavements. Lidge Alemyehu, a burden visibly lightened, had returned to his duties. "A satisfactory outcome, Holmes," commented Dr. John Watson. I ventured, buttoning my coat against a sudden gust, carrying the Thames' mournful foghorn. Holmes, however, did not share my immediate relief. His brow was furrowed, his gaze fixed on the darkening sky. "Satisfactory in principle, Watson," declared Sherlock Holmes. He replied, his voice sharp with an edge I knew too well. "But we have, by necessity, created a lacuna. The emerald is identified, its return agreed upon, yet it remains physically unsecured by any new measure. It rests in the church, its presence known, its future transfer publicly documented in this agreement, replied Sherlock Holmes. He paused, turning to me, his eyes glinting in the gaslight. Pike is no fool, Watson. He knows the value of such a relic, and he is a desperate man. This interim period, this gap between agreement and secure diplomatic transit, it is a window of opportunity, a most tempting one for a man of his audacious temperament. Sherlock Holmes responded. I felt a sudden chill that had little to do with the November air. You believe he will attempt to reclaim it? Now, wondered Dr. John Watson. I believe, stated Sherlock Holmes. Holmes stated with grim certainty, his voice dropping to a low, intense pitch, that Captain Richard Pike will not let such a golden chance slip through his fingers. He will strike, and soon. Our vigil, Watson, is far from over. Indeed, it has just entered its most critical phase, replied Sherlock Holmes. The chill evening air bit at our faces as we hastened from Baker Street, the previous day's delicate negotiations at the Ethiopian church fresh in my mind. Holmes had been uncharacteristically silent since receiving a brief, coded telegram, his brow furrowed in concentration. The rhythmic clip-clop of our hensom's horse upon the cobblestones was the only sound for a long while. The arrangement we negotiated yesterday at the Ethiopian church, Watson, while diplomatically sound, presents an irresistible temptation. Pike considers that emerald his property, stolen by circumstance. This interim period before the official handover, with the gem secured by piety rather than constables, is a window he cannot afford to ignore. He will strike at the church, and he will strike soon, Sherlock Holmes said. His logic was, as ever, chillingly precise. Our cab drew up a short distance from the modest edifice of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. A dim light spilled from a side window, and the usual quiet of the lane seemed unnaturally profound. Then a sound broke the stillness, a muffled thud, followed by the distinct scrape of a hastily opened door. My heart hammered against my ribs. Now, Watson, he urged, his voice sharp as he leapt from the cab. The game is afoot, declared Sherlock Holmes. We sprinted towards the church. As we rounded the corner, a figure emerged from a shadowed doorway, clutching a small, dark valise. It was Captain Pike, his usually flamboyant attire disheveled, his face a mask of grim determination. He spotted us, and for a moment froze. Then, with a muttered oath that was snatched away by the wind, he bolted. The chase led us through a labyrinth of narrow alleys and ill-lit streets. Our panting breaths and Pike's frantic footsteps echoed between the brick buildings. This way, Watson, Holmes called, barely breaking stride as we rounded another corner. The air grew heavy with the scent of damp earth and coal smoke, gradually giving way to the unmistakable tang of brine and tar. We were heading towards the river, towards the sprawling chaos of the London docks. From the distance, the mournful hoot of a ship's horn cut through the night. Under the flickering gaslight of a dark-side thoroughfare, amidst the shadowy hulks of tethered vessels and the constant, mournful creak of their timbers straining against moorings, we finally cornered him. Nowhere left to run, Pike, Dr. John Watson replied. He stood pressed against a stack of damp crates, the valise still clutched tight, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The dark, oily water of the Thames lapped against the slimy, dark pilings, a dismal, rhythmic sound that seemed to underscore his desperation. His own breathing was remarkably steady, his voice cutting through the damp air. It is over, Captain Pike. The emerald, if you please, Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. He snarled, his bravado returning in a desperate surge. This is mine, Holmes, acquired by my own sweat and blood. You have no right, responded Captain Richard Pike. Pike made a sudden lunge, not towards escape, but towards Holmes himself. My friend sidestepped with an agility that belied his lean frame, his hand shooting out to grasp Pike's wrist in a grip of steel. There was a brief, furious struggle, the thud of bodies, a sharp cry from Pike, and then the valise clattered to the ground, spilling its precious content. There, winking malevolently in the dim light, lay the Abyssinian emerald. Holmes retrieved the gem, his expression unreadable. Just then, the heavy, measured tread of police boots announced the arrival of Inspector Lestrade, whom Holmes had evidently alerted. His tone was brusque, yet tinged with a familiar, grudging respect. "Well, Holmes, another one for your peculiar collection of cases, eh? Got your man, I see, and the famous Abyssinian bauble, too. Caused quite a stir at the yard, this one did. Good to have it resolved before it turned into a full-blown international incident," replied Inspector Lestrade. "Indeed, Lestrade, and your timely arrival is appreciated. Captain Pike, it appears, was not merely a flamboyant thief, but a rather easily manipulated one. His belief that he could reclaim the emerald and abscond was predicated on assistance from a party with far greater reach, an individual, I suspect, who orchestrated the initial disappearance to discredit Pike and acquire the gem for their own, more complex, geopolitical ends. Pike's staged theft from his own home, complete with luminous paint, was merely the first act of a play directed by another hand," observed Sherlock Holmes. His voice was now hollow, defeated, as the constables took his arms. "He promised me safe passage, said it was all a misunderstanding, that I was the rightful owner," Captain Richard Pike answered. "Empty promises, Captain, from an unknown conspirator who saw in your vanity and desperation a useful tool. Their identity and the full extent of their designs upon Anglo-Abyssinian relations is a matter we shall explore further," observed Sherlock Holmes. As Lestrade led a dejected Pike away, the rhythmic clang of a ship's bell sounded across the water. Holmes turned the magnificent emerald over in his fingers, its green fire subdued in the dark side gloom. The true depths of this affair, I sensed, were yet to be fully plumbed, and I knew that a detailed report to Mycroft would soon be in order. The Diogenes Club's deep silence enveloped us as we entered Mycroft Holmes' familiar chamber, the quiet broken only by the muffled ticking of a distant clock. Mycroft awaited us, seated in his customary armchair. His formidable presence filled the space more completely than his physical form. His voice, when he spoke, was a low rumble, yet it carried an undeniable weight. "Sherlock, Dr. Watson, pray be seated. The ripples from this affair, I trust, are now settling," responded Mycroft Holmes. Holmes settled into a chair opposite his brother, his keen eyes already bright with the anticipation of intellectual review. I took my own seat, eager to hear his final summation of a most perplexing case. Holmes began without preamble, his tone crisp and analytical. "The Abyssinian emerald is secure, Mycroft, and Captain Pike's duplicity fully exposed," deduced Sherlock Holmes. Yet it was not Pike's greed alone that drove this engine, but a more subtle, foreign hand. Sherlock Holmes responded. Mycroft inclined his head slightly, a silent invitation for Holmes to elaborate. The only sound for a moment was the faint sigh of the gaslight. Watson recalled the initial crime scene. The ransacked study, the luminous paint on safe and floor, a masterstroke of misdirection. Not a clumsy intruder's markings, but Pike's theatrical device. It suggested a desperate search in darkness, obscuring his meticulous emerald theft and staging a false narrative. I recalled the strange phosphorescent smears, now understanding their true, deceitful purpose. It was a chilling insight into Pike's elaborate preparations. Mycroft's gaze sharpened. "And the foreign influence you alluded to, Sherlock. The agent provocateur seeking to inflame tensions over the Nile," responded Mycroft Holmes. "The key, Mycroft, lay in something as ephemeral as smoke," Sherlock Holmes pointed out. "The distinctive ash of a Bavarian cigar, found not once, but twice, in proximity to Pike's known haunts during the period he was being cultivated." Bavarian, not merely German, pointing to specific interests. It was the signature of the unknown conspirator, an agent clearly tasked with manipulating Pike. Sherlock Holmes said, "His purpose, using the emerald theft to derail your delicate negotiations with Abyssinia concerning water rights. A classic piece of geopolitical maneuvering." Sherlock Holmes responded. A heavy silence descended upon the room. Mycroft's fingers drummed softly on the armrest of his chair, the only outward sign of his contemplation. The implications were indeed grave, stretching far beyond a simple theft. Mycroft finally spoke, his voice tinged with a weary relief. "Your intervention, Sherlock, has averted a crisis of considerable magnitude," Mycroft Holmes answered. "The return of the emerald, under the circumstances you engineered, has done much to soothe Abyssinian sensibilities. Relations, for now, are stable." The thought of the sacred relic, the Abyssinian emerald, finally on its way back to its rightful home, brought a measure of satisfaction. It was a small counterweight to the often rapacious tendencies of empire. Holmes's gaze seemed to turn inward, his voice softer now, more reflective. "It is a curious paradox, is it not? The very artifacts we claim in the name of preservation or scholarship are often the deepest wounds to another's heritage," remarked Sherlock Holmes. "This emerald, a symbol of national pride and spiritual significance, became a mere pawn in a game of imperial chess. One wonders if true understanding between nations can ever flourish while such imbalances persist." Sherlock Holmes noted. The quiet of the Diogenes Club seemed to absorb his words, lending them a profound gravity. Even Mycroft offered no immediate rebuttal, a tacit acknowledgment, perhaps, of the complex truth Holmes had voiced. The great game, as it was called, had many unseen casualties. As we took our leave, the weight of the conversation lingered. The official reports would, no doubt, be suitably sanitized. The full extent of the diplomatic peril and the intricate web of espionage carefully veiled from public view. Yet the memory of the Abyssinian emerald and the echoes of Holmes's final, searching words would remain, a stark reflection of the empire's often troubled conscience.